Good morning once again. Mike, it was apt that you mentioned how choir pulls together those songs and just sounds so lovely. A couple of them winked at me back and they said, "We did good on that one." And we did. But I thought I should tell you that we're working on some different kind of music right now. One that Barry likes to call kindergarten music. It's old songs that every one of us learned in Sunday school. Things like this, Little Light of Mine, and Do Lord, Remember Me, that kind of stuff. And it hit me as I was reviewing some of the songs that we're singing. We teach our children through these simple little repetitive choruses some very deep truths. And oftentimes, when you visit folks in a home who their memory has failed them, they might not remember what used to be their favorite Bible passage. They might not be able to articulate some of the deep truths of the Scripture, but they can still sing those songs. And this morning, as I was just sitting in the pew listening to the prayers, it dawned on me there's a simple little song that goes with my message this morning. He's got the whole world in his hands. Every one of you is singing that in your mind right now. As we conclude our journey through the book of Esther, what we're going to be looking at today is how the mighty hand of God, which has been invisible this entire book, works in the midst of all things to accomplish his purposes. Now you'll remember, as we've discussed, Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions the name of God. Yet when you read this book, you can't help but be convinced that God was moving throughout the entire thing. And in the New Testament, Paul writes one succinct little verse that gives all of us hope that his hand is present, even when we can't see it. If you look on the screen, we're going to start with this passage in Romans. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are who are the called according to his purpose. Now, I hear people misquote that all the time. I hear people interpret it in different ways all the time. But when you read this scripture, remember this: God is able to work together for good all things. The passage, or the title of my sermon today is He Worketh All Things. How many times in your life have you asked the question, why does God allow this? Some of you right now are probably living through a situation where you're asking that very question. There are places in this Bible where we have promises of blessings, promises of grace, promises of healings, promises of deliverance, promises that the Lord will straighten the crooked paths. And if you read the examples of the saints, oftentimes in their lives God worked miracles, and He took a situation that was horrid and full of suffering and turned it to the benefit of the people. And oftentimes in our lives we want to skip straight to the resolution, and we become frustrated because why would God allow us to sit here? For some it's a sickness. For some it's a chronic illness or a pain. For some it's a financial problem. Others it's family issues. And the thing is, we're like the Israelites. If we were given everything on a silver platter, we'd complain about the platter. Some of y'all didn't catch that. You know, comparatively, if we consider our lives and the trials we go through against someone living in a different part of this world, or someone living at a different time in history, they would trade with us in a heartbeat. Yet our sufferings are real. And I don't mean to diminish them, but in perspective. Everything is in perspective. And so the thing is, we want to live because we're good Americans and we're taught that we should instantly have everything. We want to live in a world
where Jesus fixes all of our complaints the moment we complain. And sometimes it's hard to understand why he doesn't. When we look at the story of Esther, it's easy to read the end of the book while we're reading the first chapter as well. It's easy for us to say, well, we know God's going to fix this problem even before Esther knows there's a problem. But imagine for a minute being Esther. Imagine for a minute being Mordecai. Imagine for a moment being the average, ordinary Jew who was living your life, and all of a sudden you read in the paper that at the end of the year, you and your family and all of your kinsmen scattered across the entire nation are going to be slaughtered so that your neighbors can steal your stuff. And it's completely legal, and there's nothing you can do. Now, you've served God faithfully. You've gone to synagogue. You've read every Sabbath. You've read the scriptures, and you have prayed. You have abstained from the things that the scriptures say don't take up. You haven't bowed before any other gods. And your heart is tempted at that moment to say, why, God? Why are you leaving us in this suffering? It's hard to see God's hand in the midst of crisis. And to someone who is in the midst of pain and in the midst of such terrible circumstances, it's hard to believe that God can work all things for good. Now, there are some people who believe that God, when this scripture is read, they believe that means that God causes all things to happen and we should rejoice because even the terrible things are good. And I think that's a misinterpretation. The Holocaust was not good. And God did not cause it. Haman here in Esther deciding to kill the Jews was not good. God did not cause it. But God was present still. When we think to that old little children's song, He's got the whole world, we've got to think to ourselves, how does it apply? In the midst of someone losing a child, in the midst of us going through a tragedy, in the midst of suffering in our own lives, is God still good? Yes. But how can He take this thing and work it? Many of you could probably testify if you stood up and you said, you know, when I was going through this thing as a young adult with my children, I didn't understand. But now that I'm old and I look back, I can say the same thing in my short life so far. That there are things that I went through 5, 10 years ago that now looking back on, I see the profit. Now, I would have preferred not to have gone through them, as I'm sure you all would have preferred as well. But I would have missed the good things that God worked. Because God takes every circumstance, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's a blessing or whether it's a curse, and He uses it in our lives to perfect us for what? For His glory. And in doing so, He worketh good things. Now, this promise is only for those of us who are called according to His purposes. For the folks in the world, God isn't a redeemer. He doesn't go into the sinner's life and say, this tragedy you had, I'm going to take and use to mold you into a better person. This is a promise just for those of us who have clung to His name and who have come before Him and accepted the gift of salvation and the service of our Master. And for us, we go through the same problems, the same struggles, the same sufferings as the world, but we come out better for it. This is the promise of God. And Esther is a great illustration of this, and I want to walk through a chapter or two to show you how the hand of God, invisible but working in the background, takes a tragedy and works it to good. So if you look with me We've pretty much covered all of these chapters and some kind of recap during our different studies. You'll remember, Lesson 1, we said God is faithful even when his people are unfaithful. Lesson 2, we talked about how God bestows favor upon his children, as exemplified by Esther, and how immediately when taken into the palace, she was given special treatment, special favor, and special privileges that no one else got. Before she was even queen, she was treated as a queen. We then talked about in our third session how Esther sought the wisdom of God, and through that wisdom that she received, she triumphed over Haman and the wisdom of the world. And then the other night, we talked about how God is a rewarder. Mordecai served God faithfully, and in due season, at the appointed time, God rewarded Mordecai for his righteousness in a way that Mordecai could not have worked on his own. Today, what we're looking at is in all of the midst of this, how the hand of God works when we don't see it. In chapter 5, I'm going to give a little summary, and we are going to read parts of the scripture, so just hang on for the ride. In chapter 5, or chapter 4, I should say, the plan is discovered. Haman has called for the death of the Jews, and Mordecai, the adopted father of Esther, goes to Esther and begs her to intercede. And you'll remember she said, I can't go to the king unless he calls me, because if I do, it's death. And he hasn't talked to me in a whole month. She says then, but pray for me. Pray and fast, and I'll do it. And so 3 days of prayer and fasting, empowered by the Spirit of God and endued with wisdom of what to say and how to say and when to say it, Esther goes before the king. He gives her favor, and he gives her an opportunity to save her people. Now you'll remember, Esther chooses not to say it in front of all of the courtiers. She doesn't want to embarrass her husband. That's wisdom from God. So instead, she invites him to a private lunch. Now, I have never caught up this as I have read this book until I read it again, preparing for these messages. I always wondered, why did Esther have to have 2 banquets? And I think, honestly, it's because the hand of the Lord put his hand over her mouth and said, wait, I have a plan. So at lunch, the king is ready. She's in private. She had no reason not to say, save my life and the life of my people. Instead, she says, you know what, let's wait till tomorrow, and we'll talk again. And that's important because something happened between the end of lunch and dinner the next night. And that was God working in the background. So they had gone to lunch. Now, if you'll turn with me to chapter 5, verse 9, I want you to see the wickedness of Haman's heart. So Haman went out that day from the lunch banquet with the king and the queen, and he was joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself, and he went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches. He's bragging. The multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced above all of the officials and all of the servants of the king. He's stroking his ego, and he's making sure he has an audience for it. Now, moreover, Haman says, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. So he's living his best life. He has everything he's ever wanted. He has all the power, all the success, all the wealth, all of the prestige. He is, and on top of all of this today, he had the most wonderful surprise when the queen has singled him out for her favor. Twice, nonetheless. And he goes home and his heart is elated. And you would think with all of the things that he has achieved, he'd be satisfied. But all it took was one reminder that the Jews still exist, and that Mordecai refuses to give him honor. And it doesn't matter. He could have been as poor as a peasant, and he still wouldn't be as miserable as he was in that moment. Because no matter what we achieve, no matter what we strive for, when we do it in our human capabilities and our selfish nature, nothing is ever enough. And for Haman, who should have been in the most joyous and satisfied position, all it took was a reminder from Haman, and everything was moved. So he goes home and he tries to recapture his joy, and he strokes his ego and he says, but that Mordecai still exists. And so his wife comes up with a brilliant idea. She counsels him. She said, well, why don't you build a gallows? Let's kill him tomorrow. Before you have your banquet, so you don't mess up your great and wonderful day, which is all about you, just have Mordecai killed. And he loves the idea, so he builds a gallows, and he decides and purposes in his heart, the next morning, I'm going to go straight to the king before anybody else is up. And I'm going to beg him to let me kill that Mordecai. That unknown, unworthy, worthless man who sits in the king's gate. He won't say no. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't care who he is. And plus, I'm the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He won't say no to me. So Haman's heart is joyful again because now he has a plan that he thinks will make him happy. God is laughing. So then, after this great and wonderful advice from his worldly, secular woman, we see God working. Chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep. How many times in your life have you had those nights when you could not sleep? Does the Lord speak to you? Do you listen for him to speak to you? Oftentimes when your sleep is troubled, it is the Holy Spirit moving to accomplish one of his works. He's not loud. He's not showy. It's not like some brilliant sign's going to flash from heaven. But when you have trouble sleeping, pause and turn your attention to the hand of God and see if it's not him moving. The king here had an experience with the Lord. And it all began with his inability to fall asleep. Now you'll remember that 5 or so years before, Mordecai had saved the king's life. And as we talked about it, he made no effort to try and receive glory or honor for it. He could have pressed upon Esther to say, the king never gave me a reward. How about you put a little bug in his ear and try and get me a better job? Or maybe, how about if the king would reward me with a better house that's a little closer to work? Mordecai could have used this and leveraged it, and it would have been completely legitimate for the king to reward Mordecai for saving his life. But in truth, what happened was Mordecai reveals the plot, the king's life is spared, and as soon as it's over, the king forgets, and nothing is done. And it seems like everyone forgets. Even Esther seems to have forgotten the role Mordecai played. Yet God remembered. And instead of pressing it at the time, God holds on to this little trinket because he knows in his plan and his timing, there's a moment for it to come forth. And so the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the books of the record of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it just happens to be that the one book that was picked to be read before the king happened to be the one spot that Esther had written down, and Mordecai saved the king. Now, people believe in coincidences. I believe in providence. The hand of God, the Spirit of God, moved upon those idolatrous heathens and took that servant into that library and pulled the right text. Remember, this is 5 years. There are 5 years worth of records from the day that Mordecai was written in the book to when the king is asking. He could have pulled anything. King didn't care. He just wanted something to put him to sleep. Grain records, maybe some old meteorological weather records. And the Spirit of God leads the servant to pull the one that mattered. And he opens it up, and the Spirit of God led him to read the one section that mattered. And upon hearing it, the king said, "What has been done for this man?" 5 years it took for Mordecai to be honored. But the hand of God made sure it was at the appropriate time. This is what we mean when we say that little ditty, "He's got the whole world in his hand." We might not understand what the delay is for. We might not understand why we have to go through the trial. We might not understand everything. But if we trust Him, who is able to work all things according to the good of those who are called to His purposes, then we find ourselves right where we should be, in the midst of His hands. And so Mordecai, unbeknownst to him, is about to be honored by the king. Now here's the best part of this whole story. The king is up all night fretting, how is he going to reward this man? And finally, when day breaks and Haman is leaving his house because he wants to get there before everyone else, the king says, "Who is here that can help me with this problem?" And they said, "Well, Haman just came in." Now Haman is expecting to walk in and say, "Help, let me kill this man and satisfy my vengeance." And the king is thinking about the very same man, about giving him honor and glory. And before Haman can open his mouth, the king says, "Haman, what should be done to the man whom the king desires to honor?" Now immediately, this selfish, self-seeking, self-centered person thinks to himself, "Oh, the king must be talking about me." So he comes up with a great plan, one that is perfect for him. He says, "Give me your royal robes. Give me a royal horse. Put a royal crown on my head, and give me a royal scepter. And then take your highest, most noble prince, and have him walk me through the streets, saying, to him who the king honors, this is what should be done." And Haman thinks to himself, "This is going to be great. I'm going to get to ride on the horse, and everybody's going to know how great I am, and then I get to have dinner with Esther, and in the middle I get to kill Mordecai." And the king says, "That's a great plan, Haman. Go do it to Mordecai." And so this man, who hates Mordecai and the Jews with everything in him, has to walk the streets proclaiming like a slave would do, "Honor Mordecai." The providence of God, the hand of God, worked in those situations. Mordecai, when he woke up that morning, had no idea that God was going to reward him after 5 years of silence. But he did. And Mordecai got the vengeance and the restitution that he had wanted for all of the trouble that Haman had put him through. And in that moment, if Mordecai's heart doubted that God was going to save the Jewish people, he was reminded that God has all things in His hands. Even though they were in terrible situations, even though His people were suffering, and even though there was a threat that they could be annihilated, God was still in control of His people. And He was even using and working through the heathen to accomplish His purpose. God is able to work all things to the good of those who are called according to His purposes. Now, the story concludes. Esther finally tells her husband gives her the ability to rewrite the laws to save her people, and they are saved. And that's a great conclusion to the story. But as I started with you all at the beginning of this month, the story isn't just the book of Esther. The story begins with the exile and ends with the return. You see, the hand of God wasn't just concerned about Mordecai and Esther. He was also concerned that His will, His plan, and His purpose, that the people of God, those called out, would return to the Holy Land. When Esther starts, when this book begins, they had been allowed to go back for 50 years, but they didn't want to. Now God allowed and used this circumstance when Haman rose up to kill them all. it brought revival in the land. When God delivered them from the hand of their enemy, the people stopped and they said, "Isn't God good?" Our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and the generations before have all refused to go home, but God has proved to us that He is good. We should go back. And so immediately after the people are freed from Haman, we see in the book of Ezra, the first group returns to Jerusalem. A few short years later, another group under the priest Ezra go back and they rebuild the temple that had lied in ruin. A few more years pass and Nehemiah catches the fire and he approaches the new king, the son of the one that we hear in this book. And he says, "Let me go back and build the walls of my own city." And he goes, and more Jews follow. And after this event that almost wiped them out, this suffering, this terrible thing that happened, for which God, in His providential timing, did deliver, God used it to bring revival and to bring the people home. And this speaks to us. You see, we look at a circumstance on the very surface. We look at the very thing that's bothering us. You know, the pain that we go through, the financial problem we go through, the lack we go through, whatever it is. And we want God to fix that thing because it impacts right now our life. But God, while He is concerned with our life, He's concerned with things much greater than this moment. He sees where you're headed. He sees what His plans and purposes are for you in the next 10, 15, 20 years. He sees how your life is going to impact the next generation, and He's concerned about the next generation and their life. He sees how you will influence communities, and He's concerned about communities. And so when it seems like God is not moving, and you wonder, is God really holding you in His hand, or has He dropped you off of a cliff? Bear in mind that the plan and purpose of God for your life is part of a tapestry. It's part of a much larger work where you are woven in through the sands of time for His will and His purpose to be accomplished. And this is what Romans teaches us about God being able to take all things and work them for good. Because the good He works glorifies His name and impacts not only you, but the people and the community around you as well. And you could give hundreds of examples. I could give hundreds of examples of this from the Scripture and from church history of people whose lives, they thought nothing was moving. But then, finally, God did something and it impacted everyone around them. Hold fast to that promise that you are in God's hand and that He is able to take all things you go through and work good. And this is what we see for Mordecai and for Esther as an example. He did do something in their own personal life that they rejoiced about. But they were part of an even bigger plan, and that caused them to rejoice even more. In your suffering, God will bring something good that you can look back and say, you know what? God did do something from this thing. But then there will be things that you can't even imagine that He accomplished on top of that until you get to heaven and you have His perspective. This is a lesson that Esther teaches us. That God works all things according to His plan, according to His purpose. And He uses us. And if we are willing to partner with Him, we reap the good as well. The musicians will come forward. Our invitational song this morning is I Surrender All. I picked it because I think oftentimes we surrender some. This morning, if there's something on your heart, a suffering you've gone through, a problem that you face, and you've carried it yourself too long, but you're ready to put it in the hand of God and say, I trust that you're able to work even these things for good, then I invite you to either come to the altar and lay it before him or do it in your seat. Reverend Hester will be here at the front if anyone wants someone to pray with. And if you find yourself unsure of whether you can even place your burdens in the hand of God, then I invite you today to become sure. The Lord's promise is for anyone who believes on Jesus. If you've heard the story but you're not yet convinced, come talk to Reverend Hester. Come lay your heart before God and say, I want to believe that you are who you say you are. Let's stand together and let us sing as we go to this time